Withdrawing from
What
the
is this one?
Withdrawing from the World Health Organization, sir.
Ooh, that's a big one. So we paid $500 million to World Health when I was here, and I terminated it.
Hello and welcome to this special session on IR. Today, we are going to discuss the US exit from WHO. I would talk about different dimensions of this topic. We would discuss background first. Background in the sense, is there any kind of precedent, any examples in the past of withdrawal from WHO? I would also talk about an important fact regarding membership of WHO. Then we would discuss context in which this decision was taken by the Trump administration. We would talk about procedural challenges that Trump administration is going to face. We would talk about reasons cited by Trump administration while taking exit from WHO. We would talk about impact and consequences of this decision. We would talk about critical assessment of the decision by US President. And in the end, I would add the PSIR dimension. Let us begin with background first. On day one of the presidency of Donald Trump, he signed a number of executive orders which has stirred the international politics. One important decision which has got global consequences by Donald Trump has been exit from WHO. Let us talk about the background first. In 1949, a year after WHO's creation, the then Soviet Union and a number of satellite states in Eastern Europe withdrew from WHO. This was the result of the Cold War politics at that time, which is called a bipolar world. However, they ultimately returned to WHO in 1956. Second example, in 2020, during the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, and toward the end of his first term, Donald J. Trump submitted a letter to Secretary General of UN stating US intention to withdraw. We need to understand two things here. First, Donald Trump signed this order toward the end of his term, because of which it was not fully implemented. So during pandemic, toward the end of his first term is the context that we need to take into consideration while assessing his decision for the first time in the first presidency. Trump submitted the letter to Secretary General of UN, no doubt about that, as a result of which US funding was stopped. However, withdrawal did not happen. About 6 months later, the then President Biden, in his first day in office, wrote back to Secretary General saying that US would remain a member of WHO. So in that sense, because that decision was taken toward the end of the US President Donald Trump's presidency, it was not fully implemented. Apart from this background, there is one fact that we should know, that is Liechtenstein is the only country that is member of United Nations, but not a member of WHO. Why this topic is important? Because we are facing a lot of challenges to a multilateral world order. WTO is already in trouble, that is World Trade Organization, and now WHO faces certain challenges to its multilateralism. Let us now talk about the context, very important aspect of the entire discussion. We talked about the background, we looked at few important facts regarding WHO and withdrawal of different members and regarding membership. Let us now discuss the context in which this decision was taken. We need to understand that Donald J. Trump, the moment he became president, on day one, he signed a number of executive orders which had consequences for the world politics. We are focusing on his exit, his decision to exit from WHO. The context is, first of all, the US exit from WHO comes in the context of efforts of WHO to build a consensus around pandemic agreement. We need to understand this, right? This pandemic agreement was brought by WHO in order to plug the gaps exposed during handling of COVID-19 pandemic, the monkeypox, mpox, and other diseases. There is no doubt about this. WHO has its own shortcomings and limitations. So World Health Organization was exposed on certain fronts while handling COVID-19 pandemic. In order to plug those inefficiencies, WHO came up with pandemic agreement. So it is an effort on the part of WHO to improvise its performance. In this context of very important initiative taken by WHO, where it is trying to build a consensus in the world, an important nation is exiting from WHO, number one. Number two, we need to understand that another context in this case is coming from the health experts. Dr. Ashish Jha and other health experts argue, for example, that we will talk about what different health experts have to say in the next section. Dr. Ashish Jha and a number of public health experts argue, for example, that WHO acted too slowly in allowing US Mpox vaccine to be made available to the African countries during recent Mpox outbreak. Jha says that there are deep cultural issues that need addressing inside WHO. So again, when people like Dr. Jha, who are health experts, they say that we need to change certain things in WHO, in the wake of this kind of sentiment among health experts, where WHO needs to be improvised, US takes an exit. Third context, health experts say that this extremely unfortunate decision in the context of an urgent need for multilateral cooperation to collectively address major global health challenges, issues, possible assaults on the human health, which we are anticipating in the context of climate change and growing antimicrobial resistance. Let us discuss this point a bit. First, we need to understand that global climate change is happening. Already, the code red has been issued by the 6th assessment report of IPCC. In this context, climate change is going to pose serious health challenges to the entire humanity. In this context of upcoming challenges, WHO needs to be strengthened and not weakened. US decision to withdraw certainly weakens WHO at least on two fronts. Number one, financially. Number two, technically. I would explain both these aspects later on. And more importantly, it also weakens WHO politically. I would talk about all these things in impact and consequences section. So that is one context, climate change. Another context happens to be growing antimicrobial resistance. I'm sure many of us must be knowing what is called Delhi bug, right? That is MDR TB, multi-drug resistant TB. There are many microbial strains of bacteria which are developing sort of resistance to different antibiotics that we have today. And that would be a potent challenge in front of entire humanity. And in that context, the global health body needs to be strengthened and not to be weakened. Another important context is, considering all the challenges, WHO is in dire need of reforms. And in this context, again, Dr. Ashish Jha says that while the agency's emergency preparedness response to outbreaks has improved in recent times, in his opinion, WHO still must address underperforming personnel and what he sees as a culture that isn't responsive enough to fast-moving pathogens. What he is pointing to exactly is regarding Mpox vaccine that US developed, WHO was hesitant to accept it, and thereby it could not reach to the needy countries of African continent within time. He is pointing to the culture of WHO, that WHO is hesitant to accept the results of, say, for example, CDC, Center for Disease Control in USA, whereas WHO seeks technical expertise from USA. And he is pointing to that culture. So it was US which was supposed to play a key role in improvising that culture within WHO. In this context, US exit seems unfortunate. Now, we have been talking about US exit from WHO, but has that happened? We need to understand that aspect as well, right? Did US exit in the first place? We need to understand that the executive order has been signed, right? The catch here is the implementation is yet to happen. And there are certain issues in implementation. We will talk about that. Let me repeat this. This is the second time that Trump has attempted to withdraw from WHO, right? However, there is a catch in the implementation of Trump's executive order. What is that? In WHO's agreement with the US, it is written that US would provide 1 year's advance notice and pay any remaining balance to organization, that is WHO, in order to leave. We need to ponder over this aspect here because Trump, after becoming president, on day one signed the executive order to withdraw from WHO. Is it sort of a notice to WHO, or US has exited? If we go by what is mentioned in US agreement with WHO, this seems to be a notice. So it would take another 1 year probably, unless Trump comes up with some kind of a drastic decision, right? But that would have some kind of legal challenges within USA for that matter. I would talk about that as well, right? So I'm repeating this. In WHO's agreement with the US, the US would provide 1 year's advance notice and pay remaining balance to WHO in order to leave, right? That is the condition in agreement. But that agreement, which was made at the time of establishment of WHO with US, right? So it was made through a joint act of US Congress. And because President has taken the decision, which is not yet ratified by the Congress, the catch here is it's not clear whether Congress would have to act to implement the withdrawal. There is some sort of confusion. Lawrence Gostin, who happens to be professor and chair of global health law at Georgetown University and director of O'Neill Institution, says Trump's decision may open him up to legal action. That means legal action could be taken against his order. Gostin wrote on X, that is former Twitter, I'm reading that, Trump made unilateral decision to pull out of WHO, but we joined WHO in 1948 by an act of Congress. This is the wording of Gostin on X. Trump needs Congress approval to withdraw. That means that is one condition that he has to meet. As director of WHO Center, I'm considering a lawsuit is something that Gostin clearly mentioned in his tweet on X. Gostin also points out that the executive order calls for immediate cessation of payments. There is another detailed kind of statement coming from the US President's order to exit from WHO. The order calls for immediate cessation of payments. And we saw that the agreement that US has with WHO clearly states it takes around 1 year, and US has to make the payments of that 1 year and then it can leave, right? Although the terms of the US agreement that I'm talking about with WHO allows for 1 year to implement the withdrawal. US has already went for the withdrawal. If we look at the executive order, that would be a legal challenge for Trump to implement this executive order. Having talked about the decision, whether it has been implemented or not, whether US has exited or not, let us move on to the next dimension. What were the reasons cited by Trump administration while signing that executive order, or in the executive order, what are the reasons which are cited? Number one, reasons cited by Trump administration were WHO's mishandling of COVID-19 pandemic. That is number one. Number two, its failure to adopt urgently needed reforms in WHO's performance. These are two reasons cited by Trump. The third reason given by Trump administration was WHO's inability to demonstrate independence from inappropriate political influence of WHO member states. Though the executive order mentions it in this manner, inappropriate political influence of WHO member states, we know it very well. The executive order is pointing to inappropriate influence, to use the words of the executive order, of China. So it is sort of a power struggle going on between US and China, which we have been witnessing in global politics since long. I would talk more about that while discussing the PSIR dimension of the topic. So these are the reasons cited by Donald Trump administration. The executive order stated that, quote unquote, in addition, WHO continues to demand unfairly onerous payments. Now it has been elaborated as to why US think that it should exit. In addition, the WHO continues to demand unfairly onerous payments from United States, far out of proportion with other countries. This has been explained by the executive order. It mentions that if you look at the assessed payments, China, with a population of 1.4 billion people, right, has 300% of the population of the US. However, China contributes nearly 90% less to the WHO as compared to the US. So this, they feel, is disproportionate kind of contribution coming from US, and there is very less contribution coming from China. This is another reason cited by the Trump administration. Having talked about the reasons as to why US exited from WHO, let us talk about impact and consequences, right, of this decision. First of all, there could be a profound impact on the functioning of WHO, right, making it weaker financially, technically, and politically. I would explain these three terms, right? How WHO becomes weaker financially, how it becomes weaker technically, how it becomes weaker politically, right? The indirect impact of the decision on several global health initiatives could be bigger. There's direct impact in terms of finance, in terms of technicalities, in terms of political consequences. but there will be some certain indirect impacts as well. I would explain all four impacts: financial, technical, political, and indirect, right? The organization, that is WHO, may face fund crunch in the coming times because US happens to be the biggest source of funding for WHO since the inception of WHO, since the establishment of WHO. That is good enough reason to understand the kind of fund crunch that WHO is going to face in coming times. Second, it is very much detrimental to the WHO to lose this relationship with US because US has got a major connectedness with WHO in the form of technical expertise. We talked about the fund crunch. I would talk more about what kind of impact fund crunch will have on the WHO initiatives. But let us also try to understand the technical aspect. US has got a major connectedness with WHO in terms of technical expertise because several scientists of the US Center for Disease Control, right, what is called CDC, for example, also work for WHO. So WHO would be deprived of that expertise. That is one important consequence. Technically speaking, we need to take into consideration. Next, it may impact several public health initiatives in low and middle income countries like India. I don't need to explain this. There is something called Global North and Global South. India has been vocal about different expectations of the Global South, India being leader of the Global South. We have always talked about the additional responsibility that Global North has to take on different questions like health, environment, trade, right? In case of environment, we know that we talked about CBDR, right? Common but differential responsibility. In case of WTO, we talk about some kind of differential treatment to the Global South countries because they are not equal to Global North in terms of economic development. Likewise, Global South, number one, is economically less well off as compared to Global North. Plus, Global South lacks technical expertise. It lacks vaccinations, different other things required to fight the health challenges. From that perspective, US expertise and US funding was crucial. And in that context, right, US exit is definitely going to impact several public health initiatives which are implemented by WHO. We need to understand this. This is a key loss for developing countries because there are certain initiatives which are in collaboration with US. So WHO, US collaboration, that will also have a sort of setback, negative impact. Another consequence could be the possibility of Trump administration putting indirect pressure on philanthropic organizations, right, operating from US soil, such as Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which support WHO. We need to understand this. WHO gets sizable funding from such kind of organizations. Trump may have indirect influence on such organizations and may again result into some kind of reduced funding to WHO. According to experts, the decision makes US and other countries less safe from infectious diseases and other public health threats in an interconnected world. We talked about the fact that low and middle income countries, or to use that phrase, Global South, would face certain negative consequences. That does not mean that US and the Western world, developed world, is immune from weaknesses that US exit is imparting to WHO. There would be repercussions for US as well because we are living in interconnected world. To use the words of Robert Cuban and Joseph Nye, we are living in a complex interdependence world, right? In which there is dependence of each country on each other for different reasons, for trade, commerce, for labor, migration, and different other things, right? There's a lot of interconnection. And outbreak of disease in one country is going to spread in other parts of the world. And Western world comes in the world. We need to understand this. And that is why health experts say that the decision of US, right, would impact the US as well in terms of its own public health threats, right? Dr. Ashish Jha, for example, who is Dean of the School of Public Health at Brown University and former White House COVID response coordinator. I am now looking at different views expressed by different experts. We said that according to experts, it is going to impact US as well. First example is what Dr. Jha had to say. What he says, for Americans, it may not be obvious immediately what the impact will be, but given the world we live in and all of the factors that are driving more disease outbreaks, America cannot fight them alone. Let us try to understand this statement. What Dr. Jha says, there are two things here. Immediately, Americans may not realize the significance that their health situation will have, right? But gradually, when some outbreak will happen somewhere, and WHO would not be in a position to control it there, it may spread to US as well. So that is what Dr. Jha has to say. He further says the most immediate domestic consequence may be that US will not be privy to WHO's database of changing influenza strains. That is another important observation by Dr. Jha. He says that WHO maintains a database of different influenza strains which mutate, and every time you see new strains coming up, US would not be privy, US would not have an access to that new database. Number one, that would be a sort of health hazard for US as well. Secondly, he also says that by not being a WHO member, US would also lose access to the global database of health information that includes surveillance of new existing infectious diseases, which could make the country US more vulnerable to microbial threats from around the world. Right in the beginning, he said that outbreak anywhere may have consequence for the US. So if we are not having access to the information that WHO database contains about outbreaks of disease in different parts of the world, in the absence of information, if that disease spreads to US, that would be a potent challenge for the US. Dr. Tom Frieden, who echoes the views of Dr. Jha, Dr. Tom Frieden happens to be president and CEO of health NGO called Resolve to Save Lives and former director of US Center for Disease Control and Prevention. What he says, quote unquote, the bottom line is that withdrawing from WHO makes Americans and the world less safe. So he's echoing what Dr. Jha said. Dr. Michael Osterholm, the director of Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota, he says, quote unquote, we in the US don't experience many of the infectious diseases we see around the world. So he's again echoing Dr. Jha. He says we don't witness different diseases which have outbreak in different other parts of the world, because in large part they are stopped in those countries, right? Oftentimes through the support and coordination of the WHO. So we fund WHO, he says, US funds WHO, and WHO takes care of the disease outbreaks in different parts of the world, and those diseases don't reach US. That is the benefit that we have. That is what Osterholm says. So in his words, funding WHO is about investing in our own health here in this country. That's a very interesting kind of statement. So Americans may not realize that immediately, but they would realize in due course of time that funding to WHO is not sort of merely a philanthropic kind of donation, but it is investment in US own health situation, health sector. Having talked about the consequences in terms of finance and technical expertise, let us now talk about political consequences briefly. Dr. Osterholm, right, in what he calls public health diplomacy, quote unquote, says that the US would lose its major role as an influencer in global health policy. We need to understand this. Osterholm is making a political statement, though he's health expert, right? In what he called public health diplomacy, right? Different powerful nations try to exercise influence on different organizations, and through that, they want to influence the entire world. So US would lose an opportunity to exercise its influence in the world through WHO if it implements its decision to exit from WHO. So US would lose its role as an influencer in the global health policy, number one. Another important observation by Dr. Jha, who in a way completes what Dr. Osterholm had to say, is if China fills the funding gap, the moment US withdraws, and if China fills the funding gap, that would not be great for the US national interest. So these are a couple of dimensions, political dimensions, from the point of view of the hegemon, maybe a declining hegemon, to use the words of Farid Zakaria, right? So these are political consequences, right? Having talked about consequences, and in the light of the consequences, let us talk about critical assessment of the decision taken by Donald Trump administration. It is pretty much clear that WHO is not without controversy, right? There have been controversies. COVID-19 pandemic and the kind of work WHO conducted during that time was open to criticism. There is no doubt about that. Some of its biggest supporters, WHO's biggest supporters, right, have also criticized the bureaucracy and inefficiencies of the organization. So the criticism even comes from the supporters. However, health experts largely don't see withdrawing funding as an effective catalyst for the change. For a simple fact that if you withdraw from an organization, you are in a way stopping your role in that organization. If you are stopping your role in that organization, you cannot do anything to improvise it. And that is why it was critical for US to stay back in WHO in order to improvise it. That is the charge that Donald Trump has. The organization is not taking up reforms, it is not changing. Then it is all the more responsibility of a major nation like US to improvise the organization by remaining within the organization and not by exiting from it. The experts clearly make it clear. Paul Spiegel, for example, who happens to be professor in the Department of International Health and director of the Center for Humanitarian Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in US, he says, quote unquote, the WHO can be improved, right? There are inefficiencies, and these kind of inefficiencies can be seen in all other organizations. WHO is not an exception, right? But by pulling out and removing huge amount of money that US gives, right, you are not allowing WHO to make reforms. You are hobbling it. Absolutely correct kind of observation on the part of Paul Spiegel. He clearly says that by withdrawing, we are hobbling the organization. We are not enabling the organization to perform better, right? So this was a general discussion regarding US decision to exit from WHO. Let us now talk about the very important PSIR dimension. Many times, students of political science and international relations have that dilemma in their mind, how to apply conventional theories or what they learn in theories of IR to a particular event in international politics. Let us take an example of this event. Let us add that PSIR dimension to the whole discussion of US exit from WHO. As realists put it, I'm now taking up the conventional theories. As realists put it, that means how realists would look at it. The weaknesses of international organizations derive from the fact that international politics continues to be characterized by the quest for power among all states. We all know that realism is a statist perspective. It's a power perspective. It would talk in terms of power and states. So they would comment in this manner. They would say that international organizations, including WHO, have certain weaknesses. And those weaknesses arise out of, they derive from the fact that international politics is all about power politics. And that power politics is engaged in primarily by the states, right? And this gets reflected in the pursuit of relative gains, right? That US decision indicates. As Trump compares the US contribution with other powers, he is primarily focusing on relative gain of the US, say in comparison to China. That is how realism would look at it. How would neo-realism would look at this entire episode? Neo-realist would draw attention to relationship between international organization and hegemony. The concept of hegemony, right? As hegemonic states possess such superior power, they are the only states that can tolerate the relative gains of other states, right? So long as they are making absolute gains. So if hegemon is making absolute gains, it would tolerate relative gains, certain relative gains of other powers. Is US in that position today to tolerate gains of other powers? It doesn't seem to be, right? We can explain this by bringing in Fareed Zakaria. As Fareed Zakaria pointed out, the relative decline in the US power, he has been pointing that out since long. The hegemon, that is US, seems unwilling to tolerate relative gains of other states. In this case, we know Trump is not able to tolerate the gains of China. That is how neo-realists would explain that. So 2 points. One, the declining hegemon not willing to tolerate relative gains of others. And second, that is why it is withdrawing from the multilateral organization, WHO, right? It is evident from statements of Trump. How would liberals and neoliberals look at this? Liberals have neo-religious faith in what is called liberal institutionalism, right? And WHO is one example of it. And that is why they would be shocked. However, neoliberals would not be shocked because they have a little bit different kind of explanation of international organizations. Neoliberal institutionalists acknowledge that the existence of complex interdependence, something that Robert Keown and Joseph and I talk about. So neoliberals acknowledge that existence of complex interdependence among states does not automatically result in the creation of international organizations. Liberals say that there is inherent harmony in the states, and that is why international organizations would be formed and they would function. However, neoliberals differ a bit. They say that they clearly say that in the complex interdependence world, right, states do not automatically cooperate for the creation of international organizations. That means there is some kind of incentive for them to create organizations. It is not automatic kind of activity happening. Cooperation may be hard to achieve when states feel they have an incentive to defect from an agreement. Please try to understand this. Liberals do not speak in this language. Neoliberals have admitted that states have their own interest and states do not automatically have harmony of interest. They clearly say, neorealists, that if there is an incentive to defect from the agreement, they would do so. And that is what Trump is doing. Trump is withdrawing from the agreement that the US has with WHO. This is pretty much evident in Trump's rationale to exit. What he says is unfairly onerous payment from the US. So if US exits from WHO, that means US is not liable to pay so-called unfair kind of payments. US would save the funds. That is the incentive that Trump sees in withdrawing from WHO. So neorealists rightly point out that the moment states have incentive to defect from an agreement, they would do so. How would social constructivism look at this whole episode? Social constructivists would criticize neorealists on the ground that they discount the role of ideas and perceptions by focusing on objective interest. Social constructivists say realists, what they do is they only look at the power politics. They do not look at the role played by ideas and perceptions and how ideas shape the perceptions. And that is why they talk about the ideas of conservatism which influence perception of Trump and his supporters. So in their scheme of things, Donald Trump and his supporters are fundamentally conservative in their ideology, and that is why they would try to maintain the status quo. What kind of status quo we're talking about here? US dominance in the world. Because China is influencing WHO, at least that is how they perceive it. China is sort of a revisionist state from their perspective. If China is influencing WHO disproportionately to their contribution to WHO, this is not tolerated by Trump administration having that conservative bias. So conservative ideas make Trump go for exit from WHO. So this shapes Trump's perception of inappropriate political influence of China or other powers, other members that executive order states, right, in WHO, that make him go for an exit from the body. That is how social constructivism looks at this exit. I would add another dimension, though not very explicitly connected, functionalism and neo-functionalism. We know WHO works in health sector, which is a functional area of cooperation according to David Metternich. But it is pretty much clear now that Trump administration decision to exit from WHO underlines the utopian nature of David Metternich's functionalism. That is how you can add theory to your answers, right? So Metternich's functionalism looks all the more utopian considering what happened recently. It also exhibits how challenging it is to trade the path of neo-functionalism, because Ernst Haas made an improvement over Metternich's functionalism. Ernst Haas realized that David Metternich talks about bypassing the state, but states being only sovereign entities in international politics, you cannot bypass them. Any kind of cooperation that we observe, say in EU for that matter, European Union, has happened to the states and not by bypassing them. So becoming more realistic in his approach, Ernst Haas sort of brings the role of state in the functional scheme of things of David Metternich. So is that working now? Can we see states cooperating on the platform WHO? The recent example at least tells us that even neo-functional path is difficult to trade. A state like US has incentive to exit from WHO, right? So Ernst Haas and his neoliberal path also seems difficult in the context of hard realities of international politics. And when we say hard realities, those are realities of power politics. In the end, I would like to talk about multilateralism, an important plank of India's vision for New World Order, right? This is clearly another setback to the rules-based multilateral international order that India so often talks about, right? Already, World Trade Organization has received a setback, right? There has been a setback to what is called multilateralism in the form of setback to WTO. This is another setback to what is called multilateralism in the world today. That's it for now. Thank you.